Wade, an original poem by Jeffrey C. White. The tide remembers, soft whispers pressed against the hull of history, an ocean of names swallowed but never silenced. Feet sink into silt, the weight of flight pressing against riverbeds where freedom was once a current, not a certainty. They waited, against the moon's knowing eye, against the hush of reeds parting like prayers, against the salted hymn of ancestors who turned oceans into pathways, who carved survival from liquid echoes. The water never betrays. It cradled bodies before the land would, hid breath beneath ripples where cotton-stained air could not trespass. Here, the current is a cipher, a scripture that cannot be burned, a language of escape that no chain could translate. Even now, the waves still hum their fugitive gospel, hauling forth the weary, the waiting, the willed, those who know that to wade is to witness. To wade is to remember. To wade is to walk upon the unforgotten. What's up, what's up, what's up? It's your boy, it's your cousin, it's your best friend here, Jeff. We're back at it again for episode 3. Welcome back to the Visionaries Vault, a Black intellectual podcast. And today we're diving into the topic that cuts to the very core of Black survival and identity, Black migration and exile. Specifically, we're talking about Black Americans who have sought refuge and opportunity beyond the United States, particularly in Canada. Now, I know you can't see the image we're looking at, but let me paint the picture for you. It's a map of the North American continent, and instead of the United States, the landmass is labeled as a big heron. Now, you already know where this is going. The United States as one big heron, one massive, oppressive, gaslighting, microaggressive entity rooted in white supremacy, policing Black existence at every turn. And the metaphor? That's exactly where this conversation begins. This episode was actually inspired by a larger conversation Christian and I were having about this idea that other nations, especially Canada, are somehow this utopian space free from anti-Blackness. This belief that Black folk who left the United States and crossed the northern border had made it to some type of freedom that they've escaped Karen's reach. But history tells a more complicated story, as we know. We kind of started this podcast because we wanted to map out the parallels between systems of oppression in different places, to deconstruct the lie that any space colonized by Europeans, whether United States, Canada, the UK, or France, is truly free from white supremacy. But we're going to talk about that and break down the myths of escape and examine what exile has really meant for Black folks moving beyond the United States border. So let's talk about what it means to call America Karen. Now, we all know who Karen is. She's that entitled, white, middle-class woman who thinks the world belongs to her. She's the one calling the cops on Black people for existing in public. She's the one who clutches her purse when we step into the elevator. She's the one screaming, "I feel threatened," while standing over you in a position of power. More than that, Karen is a system. She is the embodiment of white supremacy, this idea that whiteness has authority, that is a default, that any challenge to it is met with hostility, gaslighting, and violence. And historically, this is exactly what America has done to Black people at every stage of its existence. And this is where the conversation about Black migration begins. Because when you live under the constant gaze of Karen, when you're exhausted from justifying your humanity day after day, second, moment after moment, the idea of leaving starts to look like salvation. But as history shows us, that escape is never as simple as it seems.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's your boy, Mutailai Christian Banza. This topic is one that is near and dear to me for many reasons. The Black Canadian experience, it's often one that's dismissed due to the historical erasure, systemic racism, and the continual narrative that Canada was just simply a safe haven for enslaved people escaping the United States. Now, this oversimplification overlooks Canada's own history of slavery, segregation, and racial discrimination. And I have made a deep commitment, not just to myself, to my students, my community, to continue to educate, to fight for truth, and celebrate Black identity in Canada. I want to ensure that the Black Canadian experience is not erased, but rather it's recognized and valued for its place in history. And today, I want to be able to dispel the myth that Canada was a racial utopia. Now, in Canada, we're often portrayed in contrast to the United States as a racial harmony and the land of the free, downplaying its own history of anti-Black racism and segregation. This myth makes it easier to overlook the ongoing challenges that Black Canadians continue to face today, such as racial profiling, employment discrimination, underrepresentation in leadership roles, and the list goes on. When I first immigrated from South Africa when I was 10 years old, I left a land full of people who looked like me, who spoke like me, who knew the same history I knew. And when I came to Canada, that was a little different. The history was a little different. The people were different. Even the education was different. Of course, you learn about the Canadian fur trade, and that was Canada's economic foundation. It helped establish Indigenous partnership. It created the exploration and expansion. I remember learning about 1608 and France establishing a new colony called New France, which is present-day Quebec, while the British controlled the rest of the territory. But in 1867, they formed a dominion which was called the Dominion of Canada, which they were then able to establish a Canadian Pacific Railway. That's something that was connecting the entire country, but disrupting Indigenous lands. And of course, you learn about the world wars that contributed to Canada's identity today. But I don't ever remember learning about the experience of Black people in Canada, other than the Underground Railroad. Is it just the Underground Railroad? And what I seemed to discover was that there was an entire textbook of Black history that it seems like no one knows about. People like Mifflin Gibbs, Lincoln Alexander, Hugh Burnett, Rosemary Brown, and Cools. I started to discover that Black history in Canada is Canadian history. Black Canadians have been just as much a part of Canadian history as anybody else who has settled on this land. And so from there, naturally, I started to ask myself, how come we've historically erased Black folks, Black history, Black stories from Canadian history? It turns out that the Reconstruction period in the United States didn't just have a major impact in the southern parts of the states. It also had a major impact in the western part of Canada, the prairies, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba. There was a minister of Interior named Frank Oliver in 1905. Frank Oliver wanted to protect Western territories in Canada, especially the prairies. And so he decided that he would create flyers and send down to the United States and to Europe and all the colonies for farmers, specifically white farmers looking for land. These flyers promoted wheat, land-rich soil, land for mixed farming, land for cattle raising, homes for everybody, easy to reach, nothing to fear, and protected by the government. Not only that, it included healthy, happy homes. First comers have first choice. This was in 1897. And of course, in Oklahoma, facing Reconstruction and facing the lynch laws, these farmers decided to come to Canada. What Frank did not expect was thousands and thousands of Black farmers who came to Canada. So for these African American farmers, part of the attraction of Western Canada was that it was in fact populated mostly by indigenous folks. Little did they know, in order to have that land, the Europeans were clearing out the indigenous. And so the response to this is an Immigration Act of 1911, which effectively bans Black farmers and Black folks from coming to Canada. They use the aids of immigration agents and newspapers to talk about the Great Negro problem that they wanted to avoid and to dissuade Black farmers from coming to Canada. So effectively, what I'm saying is that Black folks who wanted to come to Canada in hopes of a brighter future, a better hope, a better life, they were effectively rejected. And so, as I look through the history books, I start to understand that in Canada, the Black presence has always been unwanted. In Canada, the Black experience has always been rejected. In Canada, the Black life has always been denied. And so you don't have to look too far back, because this immigration policy lasts until 1949, and it's Hugh Burnett and the National Unity Association that effectively fight to desegregate and implement policies that would include Black folks in the narrative. And here we are, 2025, still fighting the same fight to include Black folks in our schools, to include Black folks in higher level positions, business owners, teachers, lawyers, doctors, politicians, and not just relegated to remedial work, servitude. And for me, it's always to encourage that fight and to pass that mantle on until we see the day where it's a norm to see and hear about the Black experience in Canada.
One of the earliest and most famous examples of Black Americans attempting to escape the grip of American racism was the Underground Railroad. We've been taught that Canada was the promised land for enslaved people escaping brutality in the South, but let's unpack that through an American lens. First off, why were Black people trying to escape in the first place? It wasn't just slavery itself. It was the expansion of slavery, the tightening of laws, the increasing violence toward free Black people, and the everyday surveillance of Black bodies. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made the entire country a hunting ground for enslaved people and free Black citizens alike. Suddenly, no Black person was safe. No matter where they lived in the United States, slave catchers roamed the North, dragging people back into chains, sometimes even kidnapping free Black people and selling them into slavery. The United States made it clear, if you were Black, you were never truly free. This is why some fled to Canada, because staying in America meant living under constant fear or re-enslavement, violence, and legal erasure. But even those who made it across the border, the struggle didn't end. It just changed shape. Freedom outside of the United States was conditional, just like it was inside of it. Frederick Douglass himself was deeply skeptical about the idea of a promised land beyond the United States. He warned Black people that simply crossing a border wouldn't change the realities of white supremacy. His message? You might escape American slavery, but you won't escape racism. And my guy, James Baldwin, later echoed that same sentiment when he said, "I can't believe what you say because I see what you do." That's America in a sentence. It has always positioned itself as this land of freedom and opportunity, but the lived reality of Black people tells a different story, and the same applies to the entire Western world. Because white supremacy, it doesn't just stop at national borders. So if I take you down a little history timeline a little bit, after the Civil War, you think things would get better, right? Emancipation should have meant freedom and land ownership and political power, but Black people in the South quickly realized that freedom, it came with a new form of oppression. So we have Jim Crow laws, racial terrors through lynching, voter suppression, sharecropping, and the Klan. The entire Reconstruction period, so that's 1865 all the way to 1877, was a brief window where Black Americans tried to carve out real independence, and white America shut that down as soon as they could. So we see the Great Migration, this time of where millions of Black Southerners moving to the northern cities in the early 20th century, searching for better jobs and less overt racism. And for a while, it seemed like there was something better waiting for them in places like Chicago and Detroit and New York, where I'm from, but the North had its own version of control. Redlining, like I mentioned in previous episodes, police brutality, job discrimination, white mob violence, the same system, just with a different aesthetic. Black folk weren't just being chased by the Klan anymore, but now they were being locked out of economic mobility, denied home ownership, forced into segregated schools, and aggressively policed in the neighborhoods where they were allowed to live, right? This is this establishment of what we use so loosely as the ghettos, right? Racialized ghettos is the full term. So the North may not have had their own colored-only signs, but it made sure that Black folk knew where they belonged. This pattern happened all across the country. The West Coast, the Midwest, even places like Arizona, Colorado, they followed the same playbook. And if you were Black, there was nowhere in America where you could live freely without facing systemic barriers designed to keep you at the bottom. And this is why Black Americans started looking beyond the United States, not just in Canada, but to places like Haiti, Liberia, Ghana, France, and even Mexico. So the early 1900s saw movements like Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa push, the Black expatriate communities of Paris, and a growing trend of Black intellectuals, artists, and political leaders fleeing America to find true creative and academic freedom elsewhere. So this was Exile, not just as a reaction, but as a political statement that the United States was failing its Black citizens. And the thing is, this isn't just history. The same oppressive energy is alive today. Black folk are still trying to leave the United States in search of something better, but here's the difference. Today, most of us can't. The economic barriers created over centuries have made sure of that, and generations of stolen wealth, discriminatory policies, and systemic exclusion have ensured that most Black Americans don't have the privilege of just picking up and leaving. So we're left with this brutal reality. This country was designed to exploit us, but it also made sure we couldn't leave even if we wanted to. That's the real trap. That's the system at work. This is all part of the foundations of the conversation, how history has locked Black Americans into this country generation after generation. And in the next segments and future conversations, we're going to dive even deeper into that and looking at policies, starting with domestic slave trade and all of that, to make sure that people understand the parallels between the system and what this system that we constantly talk about really is.
I hope we've established by now that whether it was France, England, United States, Canada, slavery was a norm. And in the Old Testament, it speaks of a great journey to salvation, to a promised land. And since then, there's been other epic stories and history of others seeking that same promised land. When Black people first arrived, when Black people first arrived, looking for freedom, it wasn't the racial utopia that they thought. And this is beginning in 1632 with the first recorded slave, Olivier le Jeune, who was bought by an Englishman in Madagascar and given to a man named Bayleaf as a present to him and his family. There is the 1709 Ordonnance de Rideau, which begged the king to allow the slavery to continue to exist. It said that they wanted to ordain that all Penese and Negroes who have been purchased or who will be purchased at some time will belong to those who have purchased them. There's the 1790 Imperial Statute, which effectively allowed settlers to bring enslaved persons to Canada. Under the statute, that the enslaved had only to be fed and clothed. There's the 1834 Slavery Abolition Act, which only slows down the importation and exportation of slaves, but it doesn't free the slaves until they reach the age of 25. And the list goes on. And this all begins in Eastern Canada and Halifax, where there was a major trade port. And the slogan was, "From the sea comes wealth," talking about Black bodies, goods, and the imports from the Caribbean. And so that is the history that we are trying to overcome currently. And so in order for us to truly overcome these systems and policies that have been implemented, we have to start to tell the truth about what has happened and what is currently happening. And so I look forward to continuing the discussion about these policies and what racial discrimination looks like in Canada. And so dispelling that myth of the racial utopia, I truly believe will allow for Black folks to thrive and be successful.
All right, so we've established the idea of escape. This deep historical pattern of Black folk trying to find a way out of conditions imposed on us. The vast majority of Black Americans never had a privilege of escape. And that's what we're breaking down today. How history, policy, and systemic barriers have made sure that we stayed locked in this country, whether we wanted to or not. You know what I find interesting as we reflect on the theme of Black History Month this year, African American labor, right? We have to recognize the Western world's foundations, because here's the thing. When we think about the United States, we have to recognize that it wasn't just a place where slavery happened. It was a slave society. The entire foundation of this country's economy was built on forced labor and captivity of Black people. And when we think of slavery, we have to think of it as an institution, right? And when slavery as an institution ended, the systems built to keep us in control just took new form. So people tend to think about slavery as something that happened in a distant past, but reality is the domestic slave trade, the forced migration of over 1 million enslaved Black people within the United States, that was still happening just before the Civil War. This was a system built to lock Black people into the Southern economy forever. So by the early 1800s, Virginia, Maryland, and other upper Southern states weren't making much money from their crops, but they found a new economy, selling enslaved people to the deep South. They turned Black bodies into a full-scale industry. And when I say industry, I mean it. These sales were so lucrative, but by the 1860s, enslaved people were worth more than the financial asset than all the railroads and factories and banks in the United States combined. So when people ask, why didn't more Black people, leave? The answer is simple. We were the economy. Our forced labor, our bodies, everything about us was commodified. And when the transatlantic slave trade ended, the United States didn't slow down. It just created a domestic pipeline to keep the machine running. It was never just about control. It was about profit. So just like our ancestors were the backbones of our economy, and to shift gears a little bit, I digress, but Black folks today continue to hold the immense economic power, whether corporations want to admit it or not. The recent divestment from DEI initiatives by major companies isn't just a shift in corporate priorities. It's a calculated move to maintain profit margins while disregarding the very communities that fuel their success. But here's the reality. We are still the economy. So when Target and other multi-million-dollar companies and corporations face economic downturns, it's no coincidence that Black-led boycotts and consumer choices play a role. We've always had the power to disrupt, to redirect, to rebuild. The difference now is that we must fully recognize it. This is a call to action, people. It's time to move beyond relying on institutions that have never truly prioritized us. It's time to strengthen our coalitions, invest in Black-owned businesses, and create sustainable systems that serve our community first. We built this economy. Now, let's build our own. Now, like I said, I digress, so let's shift back to the regularly scheduled program. Now, let's talk about the brief moment where it seemed like Black folks might actually be able to carve out something for themselves. Reconstruction. So after the Civil War, we saw Black men voting in large numbers, winning elections, buying land, and even starting their own town. There was momentum. It wasn't equality, but it was a crack in the system. And then, white America slammed the door shut. Reconstruction lasted barely decades before the federal government pulled out of the South, leaving Black people at the mercy of white supremacist violence and new systems of oppression, like sharecropping and convict leasing, right? All of that was created. This wasn't just about racism. It was about making sure that Black folks stayed poor. Because wealth is power. And power means mobility. Without land, without wealth, without political protection, where were we supposed to go? The reality is, the South needed Black labor, and they found ways to keep us tied to it even after slavery ended. So, what do Black folk do? They move. The Great Migration saw over 6 million Black Americans leave the South for the northern cities between 1910 and around 1970. And for a moment, it seemed like maybe this was an answer. Maybe there was something better in places like Chicago and Detroit, New York, and LA, and at first, there was. Better jobs, better wages, some escape from the direct violence of the South, but what did they find? What did we find? Redlining, housing discrimination, segregated schools, over-policing. So the North had the same playbook, but just a different accent, right? White communities made sure that Black families couldn't buy homes in their neighborhoods, couldn't build wealth, couldn't access the same level of education and healthcare. And if they did succeed, white mobs destroyed the entire community, like Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 and Rosewood in Florida of 1923, or neglected like Mound Bayou in Mississippi. This wasn't just casual racism, right? This was an orchestrated effort to keep Black people trapped in cycles of poverty. And this is where we start to see how history leads us directly to today. So fast forward to 2024, 2025, a second Trump presidency. Matt, I said that man's name, but I want to bring us back to today. And we're back in full-scale attack of Black progress, right? We're watching voter rights being stripped away, states rewriting history to erase Black contributions, and laws designed to make sure that Black communities remain at an economic disadvantage. The tactics might look different, but the goal has always been the same. Keep Black people contained, keep us powerless, keep us stuck. And it's not just political. Think about the economic reality. Black households on average have 1/10 the wealth of white households. That's not an accident. That's the direct result of centuries of stolen labor, broken promises, and blocked opportunities. And with no wealth, no savings, no financial cushion, how do we leave? How do we escape a country that has spent centuries to make sure that we can? This is why so many of us are still here. Not because we don't want options, but because those options were systemically taken from us, generation after generation, and the United States was designed to hold us in place. So, W.E.B. Du Bois put it plainly. A system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect. And that's what we're up against today. Okay, so that is a wrap on episode 3. Thank you all for tuning in, for thinking critically with us, and for being part of this journey. So remember, this is a bi-weekly podcast, so we'll be back here with a brand new episode on March 8th. Reflection is powerful, but action is transformative. So challenge what you know, sit with the discomfort of growth, and always ask the questions that push us forward and towards something better. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And always, stay curious, stay bold, and stay committed to the vision. Let's keep this conversation going.